And I think we are live. Great. Okay, good evening, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we're here with another of our virtual events. And it's a real treat to welcome Stephen Spotswood back to the program. He's here with his brand new book, Murder Under Her Skin, the second in the series. And Steve was kind enough to sign a batch of books for us, which we just got in. Let me show that to you. And so I'll go ahead and put a link to our web store if you'd like to purchase one of our autographed copies. And I'll also be monitoring that. So if you have questions for Steve as they occur to you throughout the hour, go ahead and put them in. Don't be shy. And Barbara will summon me back towards the end of the hour. I'll be happy to ask any of your questions. So over to you, Barbara.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Good evening. It's wonderful to see you all. We have an exciting announcement for those of you who haven't heard it. But first, I'm going to ask you, do you go by Steve or by Stephen?
Steve is fine. I go by either.
You're okay with that. All right. I've forgotten from our conversation last year for Fortune Favors the Dead. And Fortune Favors the Dead is the 2021 winner of the Nero Wolf Award, which is very, very cool. So for those of you who don't know Rex Stout in the Nero Wolf series, you should find out. But basically, it's an award given to books that are written kind of in the spirit or tradition of Rex Stout and the Nero Wolf novels. Now, I will also add that Rex Stout, if I remember this right, wrote something like 49 books before he ever thought of Nero Wolf. Oh. I mean, he didn't just write Nero Wolf. No. If you look up his biography, he was one of those guys that wrote, for magazines, and also not every great mystery series, every beloved mystery series is necessarily the first thing that an author thinks of. But yeah. Stephen clearly has already had two great successes with this group. So maybe he'll flower out later into something else. Who knows? Anyway, Steve, tell me what you think the Nero Wolf Award actually is. I mean, in terms of why your book qualifies.
Why my book qualifies? Well, the Rex Stout and the Nero Wolf books were a direct inspiration for Pentecosts and Parker. Back in the summer of 2018, I started a full read of the Nero Wolf series, starting from the first book all the way through to the last. And somewhere in the middle there, I started thinking about what I would do if given the chance to write those characters. And my first thought, and eventually I came to the conclusion I wouldn't want to write those characters. I'd rather create my own and see if I could use the sort of the template of Nero Wolf and Archie Goodwin to create my own pair of detectives living and working in the 1940s. Yeah, so I think that is clearly why they chose me for this year. It's if you're familiar with Nero Wolf, it's pretty clear that that was an inspiration for this series.
Well, certainly for the era that you have picked to write. I mean, Nero Wolf is kind of in the tradition, really, also of Sherlock Holmes, in that you have a genius detective, and then you have the not quite so genius partner, leg man, whatever you want to call it. And Nero Wolf, it was very eccentric. He lives in a New York brownstone. He grows orchids on the roof. He's a gourmet. He weighs like 300 pounds and wears yellow satin pajamas custom made for his size. He has a permanent chef, and part of his day every day is spent with the chef, and then the food and the whole bit. And he doesn't like to go out. So Archie really is a leg man, and that's not true. Holmes and Watson, they both are active, right? So it's a different design.
It is a different design. I do like that. I think why I love the Nero Wolf series is it takes the classic Holmesian detective. Nero Wolf is sedentary, but he's also eccentric and brilliant. But it pairs it with that very American hard-boiled voice in the form of Archie Goodwin, and I think that voice especially was
Well, his addiction is food, whereas Holmes is, into cocaine.
Yeah.
And I mean, one of the great lines in the Benedict Cumberbatch, new Sherlock Holmes thing, if you know Sherlock Holmes, I love it when he's trying to give up smoking and he says, basically it's a 3-patch problem, which is just such a great variation on the Sherlock Holmes and the 3-pipe problem. But, coming back to that, but, the structure of the Nero books often is a sort of classic Christie kind of a structure. There's one that takes place entirely within a banquet room, right? And so can't remember the name of it, but basically the murder victim dies at a banquet. And so it's either got to be one of the people who was eating at the banquet or one of the people serving at the banquet. You don't have like a universe of suspects, which is kind of a Christie design. But in the Nero Wolfe books, always at the end, I think maybe there were some exceptions. You just read it, so you can correct me. There was always a kind of a step back where everybody would arrive in Nero Wolfe's study, right?
Yeah.
And then it would be explained to you as a fair play mystery, but then this is where you would find out whether you had in fact worked out the whole crime or whether Wolfe genius was slightly ahead of you. And not, that's considered in a way, that step back structure is considered a bit old fashioned today, but I always loved it. What do you think about it?
I mean, I absolutely love it. Like the familiar structure is comforting. Like to even when the murders change and the characters change and the plots change, like to know that like I don't know, 5 times out of 7 we're going to end up back in the study with all the suspects, and the police on hand to like grab the person when the finger is pointed at them. But I also like I like the when Stout deviates. There are some notable exceptions where he just totally breaks out of that structure. Yeah.
Well, you're a dramatist, you're a playwright. And so, I would think that structure would be a very important thing to you as a playwright. And does that carry over into how you structure your books?
Yeah. I certainly, when I'm writing, I have in mind sort of the 3-act structure, which does carry over pretty well to traditional mysteries. If Act 1 is where you have the crime and why it's difficult to solve, and you get introduced to the majority of your suspects, and then Act 2 is there's action scenes, like some questions are answered, bigger questions are unearthed, things get complicated, and then Act 3 is like the climactic set piece, and things are wrapped up, and you have your denouement. I found that in writing, thinking of Act 1 is the most useful thing. Like thinking that, okay, in this first 25%, first 30%, I need to introduce, the crime and why it is difficult to solve, and then like a good chunk of the cast of characters. Like it's good to have that in mind when I'm writing, so that I'm not at like 50,000 words and still like trotting out people. But and then Act 2 and Act 3 sort of like get mushier. Like that's easier to like blend those together. For me, yeah. If that makes sense.
In a fair play mystery, you do have to introduce the murderer or the bad actor, whatever it might be, because you don't actually have to have a murder to write a mystery. It could be a blackmail story, it could be other things, but most of the time it's a murder mystery because the stakes are higher. But it's really cheating if you have a murderer who is off stage and only appears in Act 3. And that was particularly true in Patricia Cornwell's great bestseller, her first book. Sorry, I had the title and it just went away from me. What was it called? It'll come to me. But anyway, it turns out that the murderer doesn't actually appear until you're like 175 pages into it. He's not a guy that you could postmortem. That was the title. you couldn't work out he was the killer because you never seen him up until that point. And so you have a responsibility, don't you, if you're writing a fair play book, to bring in the main players in the first act?
Yeah, pretty much. And even if, let's say, the killer gets introduced in dead smack in the middle of the book or a little later, or later than the first act, I do believe that I love trying to figure out who did it. When I'm reading other people's books, it's fun, and I love being surprised, but I want to have a chance. So I think it's important to give the audience, I'm a playwright. What are you going to do? Give the readers a fighting chance of figuring it out. Yeah.
Well, maybe I should have said you can't really bring in the bad guy in Act 3. I suppose you have latitude, Act 1 and 2, but you really, you can't suddenly arrive at Nero Wolf's study and a strange person that you've never met before sitting in the yellow chair, and Wolf goes, "That's the guy." That just doesn't work. Right. So tell us about your cast. You have two really interesting women. I like the gender thing that you've chosen to write about two women in this time period, which is an interesting transitional period for women after World War II, when many women, achieved some agency that they hadn't previously had any opportunity to acquire.
Yeah. Especially post World War II, where women achieved agency and then had it. Then there was a period of regression. So my two detectives are Lillian Pentecost and Willow Jean Parker. Lillian is sort of the quintessential genius detective, one of the greatest detective working in New York City, possibly in the world, as Will would tell us. And she has an established career. She's solved countless mysteries that eventually maybe I'll go back and write in prequels. And she is also living and struggling with multiple sclerosis, which is started to affect her in body, if not in mind, not yet. And that's one of the reasons that in the first book, Fortune Favors the Dead, she hires Will Parker as her assistant / leg woman. And Will is comes from a hardscrabble, abusive childhood in a as yet unnamed rural county, who ran away from home when she was a teenager, joined a traveling circus, spent 5 years learning how to, jump through hoops and throw knives and ride horses and shoot guns and do all the things that you could learn to do at a traveling circus and sideshow. And then in the first chapter of the first book, she comes across Lillian Pentecost, and then it gets roped into living and working with Lillian, and learning the ropes of the detective trade, one dead body and sometimes bad choice at a time. So I have the very established Holmesian detective in Lillian Pentecost, and then Will is still learning the ropes, still making mistakes, still dealing with she's learning how she's growing as a human, and a woman and an adult, and dealing with past trauma, while also trying to become a good enough detective that she can ostensibly take over for Lillian Pentecost when she can't do it anymore.
Well, she's definitely deteriorating, and unfortunately there wasn't a lot of treatment available in the 1940s. And I don't know how much we've progressed in treating multiple sclerosis. It's an erratic disease. Also, there's not necessarily a steady progression. As I understand it, people can live with it in plateaus and so forth. You don't get better, but it can plateau and then off you go again.
Yeah, it varies. The symptoms vary. If you've met one person with multiple sclerosis, you've met one person with multiple sclerosis.
Right.
Every disease presents differently. Yeah.
So you can give her that challenge to overcome and a reason for her to acquire Willow, but it doesn't mean that you automatically have to start shunning her aside.
Oh no. I like them, but I like her too much. It's a slow progressive. It is a progressive disease, but hopefully we'll get a lot of books in.
Well, I like your idea of actually writing backwards in time as well as forward, because there's a lot of interesting stuff that happened. What year are we in this book?
In this book, we are in it's August 1946.
Right. So it's not that far away from the end of the war.
Oh no, not very far at all.
No. And what about Fortune Favors the Dead? Was it
Fortune Favors the Dead? It started in October 45 and ends at at the beginning of 1946.
Of course, one of the great things about writing an historical is you don't have to even worry about progressing in real time because you're already not in it. So, questions that arise with contemporary sleuths about how you age them or how time flows or whatever, you escape all that. And so you could have them take a case and start a new case the next day if you wanted to.
Yeah, it's nice. I like that leeway very much.
Yeah, no, I really do too. So, it's hard for people today, if you're not as old as, for example, I am, to remember the magic of the big top, or to have experienced the magic of the big top and how vital it was. I mean, one of my earlier memories, I must have been 6 or 7, so it would have been actually right in the time you're writing about. My grandfather took me to see the Ringling Brother Barnum and Bailey Circus when it came to Chicago. And, it was magical. And, you were under the big tents and you had the animals and you had the acrobats that were terrifying you because there they were, flying around. And you had a midway, you had all that stuff. And that's really largely vanished. There are some small circuses. If you're in Europe, you can occasionally run across like a small circus. I don't know how many of them are still existing in America. Do you have any experience with that?
The numbers wise, no. I know there are a few. I have some friends who have worked for some of the ones that are still traveling and still working. But as for like how many, I don't know.
And of course, there's a different approach about animals. I mean, elephants were the workhorse of the Ringling Brothers, and that doesn't go anymore. And this is before television, when all of the circus magic, the big circus magic that I remember, was before television. It was before acts moved to Las Vegas. It was before a lot of things. And so the circus was really a magical experience for children and a huge magnet for family days out and, grandfather, granddaughter bonding and all that kind of stuff. So you're still writing in that time period. How do you, because you're obviously quite a lot younger than I am, how did you get yourself into that feeling, into that atmosphere?
I think, I am old enough to know, to like have gone into several circuses. I saw Ringling Brothers when I was a child. I have a very distinct memory of my father taking me to a traveling circus that actually still had a sideshow, which must have been in the early 80s. And I don't know how big the sideshow was, but I do remember like specific performers. I very vividly remember the rubber woman, like the contortionist. So I've grown up just sort of loving circuses and sideshows, and they've made their way into a lot of my plays over the years. And I'm also a huge fan, and if you read this book, you might be able to tell, of Ray Bradbury's Something Wicked This Way Comes, which is the story of a supernatural circus that visits a small town. And that feeling of how circuses can bring just open the doorway to magic for children and adults who might not have access to it, especially in a world where a pre-television rural community. Yeah.
And
Also,
not just pre-television, Steve, but special effects too. I mean, now, we can see really amazing things in the movies and in TV, but, back then you really had to use your imagination because we didn't have all that.
yeah. I also had the luxury of having a friend who was professionally trained as a clown and worked for several years at a traveling circus. And when I was just starting to write this book, I sat down with him and picked his brain. Recognizing that circuses have changed significantly, but the acts are still mostly the same, and the culture especially is still very much the same. So having him as a resource to get sort of like the nitty-gritty feel of the human, of how the people that actually live and work and travel with circuses interact with each other was invaluable.
So running away to join the circus was a not uncommon kind of a thing, either for rebellious children or children that, were desperate, because the circus could seem to absorb, runaways and train them in, they could make a life. And also it was a very family oriented kind of thing because they worked together and they traveled together. And so oftentimes the circus would be kind of a family for somebody. So Willow Jean, what's her story?
With the circus specifically, is that what you?
Well, or just, obviously she spent time in the circus. So how did she get there? And
well, it's specifically like she did run away from home, and the circus was like one town over, and she talks about it in Murder Under Her Skin about how they took pity on her, and they let her in and let her become basically the lowest rung of the mucking out the stalls kind of level. But because she was smart and quick and wanted to learn, she ended up getting roped into being the lovely assistant for a couple of the performers, especially Valentin Kalashchenko, the knife thrower. And she showed some spark with him, and he started teaching her how to throw knives. And because other performers, other acts were like, oh, she can learn, they started teaching her things. And she spent 5 years with Hart and Halloway's traveling circus and sideshow, learning everything she possibly could, and building a family. Her family, which at the time was just her father, who is not a great man, it was not a place that was good for her or healthy for her. And the circus was filled, not only people who accepted her, but people of a wide variety of personalities and races and genders and sexuality, all in this one sort of insular accepting bubble, where she could be protected for 5 years and grow and learn. So she has a deep, abiding love of Hart and Halloway. And in Murder Under Her Skin, after 4 years away, she returns, this time in the role of the detective, to solve the murder of Ruby Donner, the amazing tattooed woman. And that becomes much more difficult for her emotionally than she expected, because there is sort of a thing of once you leave the family, you've left the family, and you'll still get Christmas cards, but it's not the same anymore.
No, it's not the same. But she had, in a way, that's her coming of age story, and it's also where she acquired the skill set that she's now going to be using, working, as a detective. She has good detective characters generally have very specific or useful skill sets. Let me put it that way. And so where did she learn them? So she spent the war years. I mean, it's interesting. I hadn't really thought about it until I read your first book, Fortune Favors the Dead, but thinking about it, that there, while the war was raging on, it wasn't raging on in the United States. So, circuses and that sort of thing could still actually operate as compared to, if you were in like occupied France or something. And people did need entertainment and places to go. But I hadn't really thought about circuses, still traveling the US and performing during the war. But obviously they did, and she learned a lot of very interesting things, which she's now going to get to use. But, it's a Thomas Wolfe sort of a thing in a way, isn't it? You can't go home again. Mm-hmm. Except she has to, or she feels obliged to. Which is it? Why is it that that she feels like she needs to go back and work on this murder?
Well, when she first arrived at the circus as like a 16-year-old runaway, Ruby, the tattooed woman, was like one of the people that she like attached herself to, or that who paid attention to her first. And that accepted her and welcomed her in, and became her friend. Like when it comes down to it, it's like Ruby was her friend, and now she's dead. And her old mentor, Kalashenko, the knife thrower, is the one on the hook for the murder. So she has, one friend who's gone, and then one friend who is, set heading for the electric chair. And that's it. I don't think she has a choice, because they send a telegram to Miss Pentecost, and it's like, can you please come down here and help? I can't see. I don't see any world where Will would say no or like refuse to go, because she is left, but she still considers them her family.
Sure.
Yeah.
But in a PI novel, normally, because you have them set up here as an investigative pair, normally they do it for a fee. It's a business, and and they have loyalty to a client. But this is clearly a personal kind of a mission. So, what's the structure of the agency that they are operating together? Is it a business? Is there money that underplays it so they can pick and choose? How's it work?
Oh yeah, there's money.
Most of we know that.
Yeah, which I think we set up in the first book. Like that is a very classic. Like they got paid, and again, I don't think I give a number, but it's high. It's like Nero Wolf high. And yeah, for most of their work, they get paid. They get paid enough that they can do some cases pro bono, basically. It's been too long since I wrote Fortune Favors the Dead, but I think Will puts it somehow like for the people who can pay, we make them pay as much as they can, so that for the people who can't pay, we can still help them.
So there's a certain aspect of achieving social justice in here. It's not all business with them.
Oh yeah, I think
which it would have to be if there wasn't enough income or enough money, underpinning the whole thing.
Yeah, I think both of them have like very deep social justice roots. Like they want to help the people like that nobody else is helping, or people for whom society is not built for. Yeah.
Right, but if it's not funded by the government, like public defenders, then I'm always amused in amateur sleuth, and particularly the cozy field. Well, they'll have some like bookstore owner or cupcake bakery owner or something who is constantly engaged in investigating and solving crimes, and never quite they don't have any staff. Maybe they have a cat, And, I haven't figured out how it is that without any private income, they just can if I just put a sign on the door of the Poison Pen, and say, closed, we're out detecting, that's not going to work really well. And I think it's one reason, it's an interesting question, but I think one of the reasons that back in the golden age, there were a lot more clerical sleuths. We had Father Brown and we had Rabbi Small and whatever. And part of that was because that solved this problem, in that you could have a sleuth that could take, worthy cases, not necessarily, certainly not income producing, but this person was already, salaried or had an income from their vocation, profession, whatever it is. And so they had both the time and the resources to go off and help people. And a lot of amateur sleuth books never really address that. I mean, it's part of that whole suspension of disbelief you have to get into if you think your dog sitter, is like on their 12th investigation. And I mean, I'm not making fun of it. They're fun to read and all, but it is, I think if you're not in that particular genre, you do have to address the idea of, are your people professional and therefore doing it for money, or do they have the resources to take stuff on occasionally or all the time, for another purpose. And so in this case, if it's so personal to Willow Jean, her friend is dead and her other friend is suspected, can they in fact go and investigate it?
Yeah. And they can, I actually think I have Big Bob, the head of the circus, saying he's insisting on paying them. Again, it's been too long since I wrote the book. But yeah, I do think about money, and they are professionals and they do get paid, and they made, in Fortune Favors the Dead, they got a
right. So what's this Pentecost background? I mean, you've told us about Willow Jean and all, but catch us up for people. This is only the second book, so I'm assuming that many of you who might come to this book will not necessarily have read the first book, or you won't have any in-depth knowledge. So what's Miss Pentecost's background?
I have revealed almost nothing about William Pentecost's background. There is one detail that gets dropped in Murder Under Her Skin that I'm not even going to spoil.
Okay.
But I very purposely have left, for now, her background opaque, which is not to say I don't know it and I'm not going to reveal it, but I want to do it piecemeal.
Right.
Like, she's a very private person, and also Will, as the ostensible narrator, the person who is writing out these cases, also is kind of protective of her. In the first book, we learned that Will is writing these stories from sometime in the future, however many years, we don't know. She knows more about William Pentecost when she's writing it than she does as the character in these books. But she's protective, and she doesn't want to spill her boss's secrets until she needs to. That said, we will eventually find out a whole lot more about William Pentecost. Just not in the first two books that much. You just need to know that she's smart. She thinks about the victim more than she thinks about the killer. She has a sort of a philosophy of if you, by learning about the victim, you can better understand how they might have intersected with a murderer. And she has been living and working with multiple sclerosis for some time. Yeah, and she's been working long enough that she is hailed as a great detective. So she has a history under her belt as a professional.
Well, one of the great things about a series is that you have to start it somewhere. You pick a time and a moment in somebody's life and you start there. And then my experience is that almost every long running series, there's a prequel or, but you don't know enough about the character yet to do that. You write along. I remember Michael Connelly, wrote, I don't remember how many books before he wanted to give us more backstory on Harry, and also to take Harry as a cop out of personal cases and give him a case because he was just a policeman, which is how it worked. And I find in most long-running series, there's eventually a prequel, or as you might choose to do it, you leak in more of the characters' backstories as you go. So it's a cumulative process. But I often wonder if in part that's because you're learning what it is as you're writing it and as that character develops.
Yeah. I have some answers. I'm leaving some things open because I know I will probably come up with better ideas given a few more books under my belt. But yeah, I think it might be both. It might be I will leak things in, and there might also be a prequel. Or I'm thinking of John Sanford's Lucas Davenport series, where it was many books in, and then he did one where it was the first half was Lucas as a beat cop, before he became a detective, and then the second half was him present day, but it was the same case. It was the same killer. It just spanned 20 years, and that was really nice. I really like that.
It was nice. Part of it is you don't really want to fix your character in cement. You don't want to handicap them with too much stuff that you've designed for them, and then they evolve as the books go along and things happen, and you can't undo what you've done.
Yes, I'm very, very aware of that too. That I don't want to write myself into a corner where I establish that something about somebody's biography that later on I'm oh no, it would have been so much better if X. Yeah.
Well, you can't not give her multiple sclerosis. That is something you have endowed her with that, but you can write about her before the disease became a problem. You can write about her later as the disease has affected her. I do think, the John D. MacDonald sort of thing where every single time it was a complete reset, for his character. So there were no real history involved. That's harder to do today. I think readers demand more character and more character development than then. Even Lou Archer, I think somebody famously said about Lou Archer and Ross MacDonald's series, all these MacDonald people writing mysteries, that if he turned sideways, nobody would see him. He wouldn't even cast a shadow because he was really, he was the viewpoint character, but he wasn't as a character crucial to the telling of the story. Where Travis McGee obviously, was much more central. So, storytelling evolves, and what people want to read or what they expect, I think, evolves over time, or you can be a trailblazer and go back to that design. Everybody say, oh, look, it's, completely different. Here's a new Lou Archer character. And isn't that wonderful?
Yeah. I wouldn't want to go back. I like character growth too much. I could my books they're character driven before they're plot driven. And the fun I have is is Will's growth of okay, what lessons did she learn in book one? How can she carry that into book two? What mistakes does she make in book two that I can bring into book three? I very much enjoy watching characters change and grow over time.
It's wonderful. So you clearly are planning to write more books about this particular pair.
I will right now. I will write as many as people will line up for. I have enough ideas that I'm looking forward to a marathon.
So how do you find that writing novels differs in your creative process from writing plays? Is it the same part of your brain? Is it a whole different thing?
Oh, I don't know. With writing plays, I'm very aware of writing in this limited theatrical real estate, physical real estate. I'm limited in space, but also I'm limited in time. and attention. Like you can't stick an audience there for like 7 hours. Like I have to like shorthand so much and condense things. And plot wise, it's got to be like dominoes. It's like there's just nothing there that's extraneous. But with novel writing, like the biggest difference and the one that I most enjoy is that I get to externalize people's inner worlds. I get to externalize Will's inner world. Like we get to go into her head and see her thought process and see like her doubts and fears like take shape inside, like where, you know, when she's not vocalizing it. Like that's I think the biggest, like I get, you know, constant interior monologue in writing a first person protagonist, and that's the most fun. The biggest challenge has probably been with theater. I have a ton of collaborators. I have a director, I have costume designers, I have set designers, and in writing, I have to constantly be thinking about what people are wearing and where they're standing and what their hands are doing. And I can't just devolve into one dialogue line after another. Like I have to do all the visual heavy lifting.
I don't know how much playwriting can be dynamic, but I say that in the sense, if you write a play and it's, you know, taken on the road or pre-trial for Broadway or whatever, I can't even remember what the term is for it or something, and your audience reaction indicates to you that some of it isn't working or you could do better, you still have an opportunity, because it is dynamic. You have an opportunity to revise your play.
You constantly have an opportunity. Like
right.
I've had plays that have been done, like that I wrote 10 years ago, that if there was like somebody who wanted to produce them tomorrow, I could go back and revise it now. Like it's, you know, every production, every performance even is like a chance to reinvent, a chance to improve. And with novels, it's when it hits the shelves, it is done.
Well, exactly. And, you know, and your audience is not that immediate. I mean, you do in an age of social media and email and all the rest of it, authors get a lot more feedback from audiences than they used to when you had to write a formal letter to the publisher and, you know, the author might not ever see it. But there is a distance between you and the audience and a time lapse between you and the audience that's different than if you're standing there in the theater and you're watching the audience reacting to your play. So do you find that changes how you do things, because you can't revise it and you have to sort of anticipate the audience reaction? Is it a different anticipation than if you're writing a play and you're expecting it to be a live performance?
I don't know if it's a different anticipation. I do know I am like much more aware. Like I am very careful. I'm with books. I'm very careful of like, I want to get things right. Like, and I have a fantastic editors at Doubleday who they're, you know, put their brain to it too. And like, just make sure we get it nice and solid the first time. The anticipate, like the one thing I don't like is like having this, like this book has been done for the better part of a year. There have been some like new like edits that have been done, but like the vast majority of it has been done for a while. And like having to wait that long, like being like honestly excited about the story and like some of the scenes, and like, oh, I can't wait for people to read this. Oh, I hope they like reading this part as much as I enjoyed writing that part. Having to wait a year for that feedback to actually like trickle in is tough. I do enjoy the immediacy of playwriting and like being there with a live audience. Yeah,
of course you do. No, I can easily understand that. Actually, one of the reasons, like, you know, this is our 32nd year, but like in 6 months into this whole deal, you know, I recognize that, and it was one of our very first author events, and of course it was live because this was, you know, all before COVID, and I recognized that the author couldn't really remember the book that well because the author had written the book, like, as you point out, some time back, and a question came in, and I saw this kind of deer in the headlight look overcome the author and going, shit, I can't remember any of this. And I thought, okay, this is my job. My job is to read the book and be there with the author and feed the author the lines, or cover with the audience and the whole bit. So we began an interactive operation that we continue to this day. And part of it is because of that time lag that you mentioned. It's really hard for you, even though you wrote the book. A lot of the details are stuff that audience, the readers fasten on. You're deeply into it, maybe even 2 books on by then, and you just don't remember.
Yeah, it's exactly right. I'm committing now, or at least like in the cycle now, for like a book a year. So this like over the weekend I was accepting the Nero Award for Fortune Favors the Dead. Murder Under Her Skin,
Right.
like released this week. The next book is with my editors, and I'm drafting book 4.
Right.
So it's having to be like, what happens when? Like, what have I revealed in book 2? What can I talk about yet? I imagine it's going to get more difficult as things go on, which is fine. All that means is that there's more stories out there, and I just I'll have a harder time remembering which is which.
Well, the thing is that the authors are now expected to promote their books in a way that 50 years ago publishers did most of that work. There wasn't all this interactive stuff. Author tours oftentimes didn't really exist, and so forth. In fact, I read the other day in something that many author contracts now require the author to make a quantitative number of social media posts and so forth. I'm not saying every contract does, but it's expected to be more of a partnership between the publisher and the author, which is why Lucky Stephen is here talking to me, as opposed to just staying home writing his book, right? Because this is part of the deal, is that you are in charge you're expected to participate in bringing an audience to your work.
Yes. And having spent, 10 more years like working in producing small plays and then playwriting, and many times doing the marketing myself, like it's a very familiar feeling. And in my case, I have a fantastic publicity team at Doubleday who do the vast majority of the work. Like, they set up the talks, both virtual and live. They get the book out there, they get my name out there, and I can sit back and just I'm on social media already. I'm already on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, maybe TikTok in the future. So I get just to respond to readers who reach out, and that's a lovely part of it. I like that a lot.
Well, not every author does, but you're expected to do it. And, COVID and Zoom have really changed the game in a lot of ways. We're coming up on our 600th Zoom event and 130 some thousand podcast downloads, or whatever it all is. And fortunately, we were already doing all this before COVID hit, so it hasn't been any kind of a learning curve for us. We just had to figure out Zoom and buy some better equipment. But what's happened in a really positive, while we miss live audiences in the store, fortunately, we're coming back to some in January, assuming that Omicron doesn't, knock all that out, is that you can reach a much wider audience, and you can also have a much more in-depth conversation, because there's not that audience out there going, hey, wait, I have a question, whatever. And you're not trying to manage the autograph line, which is going to take up, if you allocate, let's say, 2 hours to the whole deal, depending on the author and how many fans are there, you have to think about all of that. And so Zoom, we've really gotten to know authors in a whole different way, authors we've known for years, through Zoom conversations without the live audience. So we're going forward as we did in the past, doing both. We video our live events in the store. And that can really be fun, because then you do get some audience feedback right away, in the store. And instead of people having to submit their questions in the comments field, which is a completely different thing. But I love the fact that you authors have been able to reach and engage people all across the country, all across the world, and all that you would not have done on a more conventional. I mean, you're in Washington, I'm in Scottsdale, and I'm sure there are people watching this, who are in Los Angeles and Seattle and, wherever, all over. And I really love that aspect of it. It's a game changer. And it'll be interesting to see how we go forward when maybe some of the Zoom restrictions loosen up. And that would be true for you as a playwright too, because it's been, a lot of theaters just went dark, didn't they?
Yeah, a lot of theaters went dark, and then there's also a lot of theaters that started doing like online productions. They did
exactly
streaming of old productions, but also like made for Zoom theater.
Mm-hmm.
And it it reached an audience that would otherwise that were limited in how much theater they could see, either by like where they lived, or like whether they could afford it, or whether they were like had some like physically capable of getting to a theater. And I know as things are opening back up, like there's a big conversation about, well, that's gonna stay. Like Zoom theater is here to stay. Hybrid theater, where you have like live performance and streaming, I think is here to stay. And I hope and I think obviously, maybe not obviously, but like in this case, like with authors and events like this, I don't think we go back from. I think absolutely have live events again, because I miss human beings, and because like those kind of events are exciting for both, I think, authors and readers to like be in.
Well, they are. I mean, we had an event with a very dear friend last week, and we had a relatively small live audience, and then 4,000 people watched it. And
that's fantastic. Yeah,
so we had the best of both worlds,
yes.
Which I think was great. I'm an opera devotee, and I really think the Metropolitan Opera and other opera companies did a magnificent job in coming up with ways to bring opera and music to people through streaming. And they've acquired audiences and an income stream, I might add, that they didn't have before. So audience expansion may well, and it's also forced people to learn how to do that at the audience end. People have had to learn how to, get onto Zoom or Crowd or whatever platform that it was. And so that resistance has been overcome, because it was the only thing you could do.
Yeah.
And it'll make it easier, I think, to go forward as well. So, it's an interesting thing. You're writing about the 1940s before any of this applies, which I think is just so much fun for you. You get to live in both worlds at the same time. Is there anything specific you'd like to say about the story of Murder Under Her Skin?
Specific that I'd like to say? I don't know. I love it. I mean, while it being like a traditional murder mystery, it's also a story about like found family, and how like sometimes you can choose your family, sometimes you can't. It deals with the fallout from World War II, and PTSD a little bit, and I think like all of this series probably going forward, it really delves into looking at the like this golden age of America, that we now call it a golden age, but looking at that from another perspective, another point of view, and seeing all the people and the cultures, and the communities and the families that get destroyed or crushed under like this giant, the paving, of the great American dream, and yeah, examining this very white picket fence, picture perfect time in America, from the points of view of people for whom that dream was not designed, and who got left behind. But at the same time, it's still a murder mystery at a circus. So hopefully people will enjoy all the aspects of it. Yeah, that's a long rambling answer.
No, it's a tremendous amount of fun. And I think the best mysteries provide you with, windows into society. Contemporary ones, it's often said, I certainly agree with it, that they cut along the edge of social change. And sometimes you can learn more about how the world's working in a contemporary mystery than you might from, reading newspapers or anything else. I think oftentimes novels have a kind of predictive quality sometimes that are being written because authors are imagining, if this, then that. But I like historical ones. I've learned a lot of things about my life that I didn't know when I was living it, because you can't encompass the entire world, and I find that, reading books like yours open up windows to the past in my life that I thought I knew, but it turns out that there were things about it that I was oblivious to. And, so I really love that experience also. And I'm glad you picked that time. I read somewhere that the best time ever to live in the world was to live in the United States in the second half of the 20th century. And I'm not saying that I necessarily endorse that, but we did have that American dream. We came out of the war, we survived it. It looked like prosperity was ours and society was relatively, at least on the surface, relatively homogenous. And now look at it today, where it's completely fractured, and we have to figure out how we can get back together again, if we can ever get back together again. And so I think you've done an interesting job in portraying, that time. Let's call Patrick up and see what he'd like to contribute, or if we have questions from the audience. It's like exciting theater, right? Where you wait for
just waiting for the entrance.
It's so much fun. It's like a great entrance, isn't it?
Yeah. Let's see. I have a question that I wanted to ask too, but somebody watching is asking. Tell us about these wonderful covers. Have you had some input into the designs?
So both of those covers are designed by Rui Ricardo, who is a fantastic artist. You can find him on Instagram, and if I wish I had known you were going to ask this, I would have found his Instagram handle beforehand. I have had some say in the covers. In the second book more than the first, just because there happened to be there were two different versions. There were two entirely different choices to go between, and I leaned heavily on. I actually got to choose. They were like, "Which one would you like? We can go either way." And I'm like, "Are you sure this is how this works?" An author get to choose. And I went with that.
It doesn't always work.
I know. Way. No, it doesn't. My wife's an author. I know how it works usually. But I got to say, I love this one where it's framed within the body of the tattooed woman.
The colors are great too, and it's very bold.
It's so good. His work is so good.
It is.
Yeah, I love how he adapts the story into a visual medium. It's really lovely.
Anything else there?
Well, I wanted to ask, on the subject of carnies and circus and things like that, are you a fan of William Lindsay Gresham's Nightmare Alley? Or have you ever seen the film version of that?
I have not.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
I don't think. No, I don't think so.
Oh man, you'll love it.
But now I'm gonna. Yeah.
Tyrone Power. The film's awesome, but it's a wonderful novel too. Set under the Midway. Can you talk a little bit about your journalism? When you were discussing, PTSD and how it figures into the this book, PTSD related to World War II soldiers, I was reading, about your journalism and a lot of what you've done.
So for the last, for like the last 20 years, like one of my regular day jobs is as a journalist. And for the last almost that long, I've been writing for a magazine that covers healthcare in the federal sector. And my beat has been Veterans Affairs. And I started right as the first wave of service members were coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. And so I've seen like the discussion about post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury and environmental exposure like grow and change, and like the science grow and change, and like the different story, hearing so many stories of service members coming back and dealing with it, and then watching the national conversation about these issues evolve exponentially over the last 2 decades, and us understanding better and better like just how complex these issues are. Like PTSD is a lot like multiple sclerosis in the fact that it is like it can present so very differently and can change drastically over time. So yeah, I think that like having been steeped in it for 20 years, like that is it just informs my writing. And the fact that we are going into like that I'm writing in like the immediate post-World War II era, where there was not the conversation, there was not the understanding that so many of these soldiers were suffering from PTSD. We just didn't have the language, and people wanted to go back home and not think about it. And
Alcohol.
And yes, alcohol and other things, and it all gets suppressed and just emerges later in life in unpleasant ways. But in my books, we're gonna explore those things.
So much of the classic noir period, that post-war noir was, analyzing just what you're talking about, the underbelly beneath the Norman Rockwell facade.
Yes.
Addressing those kinds of things. Yeah.
Anything else, Patrick, that anybody's brought up?
Any TV or Hollywood interest in these books yet?
If it is, they haven't told me yet, but I hope so. I've had so many people say that this would make a great masterpiece mystery series. I'm just like, if you know somebody.
Well, keep writing. Sometimes 2 books isn't quite enough,
Yeah, no, I'll keep going. I'll give a showrunner more than enough material. Like, yeah.
I got a question for you, Steve. How did you was drama or playwriting your first love, or did you start writing short stories and things? How did you become a playwright?
I went to undergrad with the idea of like writing short stories and novels, and had done some little bit of acting in high school, and then drama majors the world over. I got cast in a show my freshman year, and suddenly I'm a double major in drama and English. Ended up writing a show for my senior thesis, and then graduating and going into journalism, getting a job at a small town newspaper, and eventually getting roped back into theater via my wife, my girlfriend then, my wife now, who went to grad school for theater history and criticism. And I ended up following her to DC and going into the same theater program, but for playwriting. That sort of like cemented me as a playwright and like to working in live theater.
What kind of work does she do? Does she do young adult?
She writes young adult. Yes, she is like solely young adult. She's got a number of her solo books out. She's also edited a few anthologies, and she's got a book coming out in the spring called Greater Nothing, which is her and 3 other authors it's a World War II era retelling of Little Women, with each author writing from the point of view of one of the different March sisters, which is really exciting.
That's very cool.
Exciting. Wow, it sounds terrific. Well, Steve, we've kept you a long time, and I know you're tired because you've been in a class. So thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you for your second book. And let me remind everybody that we do have autographed copies of Murder Under Her Skin, and Fortune Favors the Dead is available as a paperback. And it's great. With only 2 books, you can introduce people to the series. They don't have to go back and write 14 books or something to catch up. So wonderful present idea, or just fun for yourself and a nice escape during the holidays or anytime thereafter. So thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you. This was great. I'll do it every year if you'll have me.
Well, I certainly hope we can do
Hopefully
that.
in person
We're in the business of developing authors, and we're a bookstore, but a lot of what we do is developing authors relationships, and trying to bring authors to customers. So it's a slightly different approach, but we love it. And it's especially great when we catch you with your first book, because if you miss it, you can't ever go back to it. So it's wonderful to do that. Patrick has a fabulous eye for new talent, and he's done some wonderful events with new authors, but we love doing it. So thanks for sticking with us. We really appreciate it. Good night, everybody. Hope you have a wonderful holiday season, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Bye.